Yeah, great question. So all that time I was studying why sometimes personal development principles worked, or success factors and principles worked, and sometimes they didn't. A big part of what I was missing was neuroplasticity, but the other thing that we're sometimes missing is in people's internal system. So epigenetics says that our genes can change their expression based on the internal environment. Well, there's a lot going on with the internal environment. Like I mentioned, cortisol. So if you're a person who catastrophizes all the time, you got cortisol running through your body all the time. Your ability to engage in neuroplasticity will be harder. So neuroplasticity requires deep practice and focus. Think of it as conditioning in neural pathways. There's four things that I say contribute to conditioning: repetition, right? Repeated, spaced repetition, more spaced and random, the deeper the conditioning. Intensity, that's how a phobia happens. Such a big old shock. They saw their parent jump through hoops to trying to get away from the snake, and the emotion of that scene, that poor 2 or 3-year-old remembers that for the rest of their life, never knowing why they're so afraid of snakes, but they can trace it back to, by some of these practices we're using, you can trace it back to why that person is afraid of snakes, and then you can rationalize it differently. There's a whole process to go, but literally it takes minutes. It's not a months-long thing. So that's the intensity piece. And then we have duration. So that constant duration over and over and over, that's going to do it. And then focus. So because where we focus, it grows. So if we're putting so much attention on something, we're actually adding intensity. So focus and context could come under the intensity, but I do it that way. And then the other thing I would talk about is the impact of dopamine and serotonin. If you're a leader or a business owner and you're not looking at how the effects of dopamine and serotonin influence behavior, I think you're leaving money on the table, leaving resourcefulness on the table. They have studies where they've shown that rats will, to get a dopamine hit, they will run across electrified tiles repeatedly at a signal to pull the lever to get that dopamine hit. Literally, and these studies, some of them are very cruel. I don't advocate them, but they're giving us information, and that's all I'm doing is conveying. But literally until their feet burn off, not off, but where they can't walk anymore. They run over these electrified tiles so many times at the feet, they can no longer walk, just to get that dopamine hit. So that dopamine is very, very strong. And when you start thinking about neuroplasticity and habit change, I definitely think people should understand serotonin and dopamine and how that impacts them, and then use those to their advantage. You can create a new habit much faster if you apply dopamine and understand how to apply the serotonin. Can you provide examples of real life references and pictures amplifying stress and anxiety during downward descent? Uh, my own experience, I had a very seasonal business, and I've experienced seasonality before, because we would have like a life promotion, and every year during that promotion, 40% of the year's life insurance was sold during that period of time. You talk to people in retail with the Black Friday, that sometimes 40% of the retail sales occur from Black Friday through the end of the year. That's for the whole year. I mean, so this seasonality, what happened in my motorcycle business, because of the seasonality, I would be looking like down the barrel of this is a dire situation. And sure enough, every May thing would take off. And it was very easy for me to go into a funk in March and April when the business wasn't coming in. And because it was an international business, I sold globally, but I competed locally. So essentially, I was renting motorcycles to people from around the world to ride in Northern California, great riding roads in California, do trips around the United States, 10 to 30 day type vacations. And because it's a global scenario, there could be impacts happening around the world that would stop people from reserving. So people are starting to reserve for their year in February and March, and it would just dry up. It's like, what's going on? So